I was probably in college before I realized that Randall Jarrell had written any poems other than The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner. It's a great poem. It's 5 lines long and was anthologized very widely. It was a poem I read, several times between middle school and high school, and so it was really my only reference for him. I started to read a little more of his work in college and then even more in graduate school. One of the poems I really fell in love with early on was 90 North. 90 North is a mostly iambic poem in quatrains, pretty much free-ish verse, though it's the iambic line comes back persistently, if not always, in pentameter. But so 90 North is a poem. It's a monologue, like a lot of Jarrell's poems, and also like a lot of his poems, it starts in the voice of a child. Jonathan Farmer has remarked that really a lot of Jarrell's most touching work is written either in the voice of children or about children, and I would add to that often in the voice of or with a focus on housewives or women without a great deal of power. So I think there's a little bit of a vulnerable note there. So 90 North, the boy narrating the poem, describes fantasizing as a kid about being at the North Pole and sort of enjoying his conquest and his heroism, and even sort of finding something almost comforting in a shivery, safe sort of way, and imagining the extreme cold while, of course, being bundled up safely in bed. He begins the poem, "At home in my flannel gown, like a bear to its flow, I clambered to bed. Up the globe's impossible sides I sailed all night, till at last with my black beard, my furs, and my dogs, I stood at the northern pole." And of course, the designation 90 North refers to the North Pole. So that's the first few stanzas, and then there's a break. And in a wonderful turn, the rest of the poem takes place as the same character, now all grown up as a man, who has actually grown up to be a polar explorer and is has reached the North Pole. And it is a little different than what he expected. He says, "I stand here, the dogs bark, my beard is black, and I stare at the North Pole. And now what? Why go back? Turn as I please, my step is to the south. The world, my world, spins on this final point of cold and wretchedness. All lines, all winds end in this whirlpool I at last discover, and it is meaningless." So he goes on to kind of reflect on the folly of his fantasy as a kid. And then the poem has this wonderful sort of peroration at the end that I really loved. I really fell in love with the end of this poem first. So the poem ends with his summary of his conclusions as a grown man, having lived out his boyhood fantasy and become the what he thought would have been what he thought was going to be a gratifying act of heroism turns out to be a brutal and excruciating and ultimately empty gesture. So he ends the poem, "I see at last that all the knowledge I wrung from the darkness, that the darkness flung me, is worthless as ignorance. Nothing comes from nothing. The darkness from the darkness. Pain comes from the darkness, and we call it wisdom. It is pain." And that, I thought, was just a stirring, gripping, satisfying way to end a poem. It felt like maybe a sort of a more existentialist version of If or Invictus. It seemed brutal and cool in a way that especially in my early 20s seemed to flatter my sense of world weary manliness. So I I retained my fondness for this poem, but it's really been more recently that I've come back to it and begun to see it in a slightly different light, because, of course, Jarrell is, in so many of his poems, really gentle. I mean, really his best poems, I think he's often very gentle. And this seems to be such a tough guy poem. And it is that, in part, but this question of pain and wisdom really became an everyday affair, an everyday concern. Maybe 18 months ago or 15 months ago, whenever it was, that the fucking quarantine started. And I began to see, wherever I turn, a certain kind of article. So I pulled up, with about 30 seconds of Googling, a slew of just headlines from a lot of scholarly publications, a lot of popular periodicals, newspapers, magazines, and popular websites. I'm just going to rattle off a few of these headlines that have to do with, of course, the global pain we were all experiencing and continue to experience, and the response we got to that from our public intellectuals, from our media, from our public health experts. The response being, of course, aha, you thought it was pain, but really it is wisdom. How to make the pandemic work for you. So I'm just going to rattle off these headlines that I found really with no effort very quickly. Just this afternoon. So I'm not even going to read the names of all the publications. This first one's from the Columbia School of Public Health, but I'm just going to go straight through the headlines. They're all real headlines. So the first one, 10 lessons from our pandemic year. Then, how to make the most of time spent social distancing. Wisdom in the time of COVID-19. The great coronavirus pandemic of 2020. 7 critical lessons. Wisdom in the age of the coronavirus pandemic. 7 tips for self-improvement in quarantine. Boy, that one's fucking infuriating. And then finally, from surviving to thriving, pandemic wisdom must chart our course. And that is exactly the kind of headline that sent me back to 90 North. Because Jarrell refutes that claim, but I began to read in his refutation something other than just a jutting jaw, other than just a stiff upper lip and a puffed out chest and a refusal to bend to the elements. I started to read in it a kind of compassion. I started to read something gentle in his pretty harsh claim in this poem. That is, if our suffering should be a source of wisdom, then the proper response to it is to improve yourself, to grow, to learn, to gain wisdom. Whereas, if it's just pain, then it's not your fault if all you do in response to it is suffer. You know, that what is implied by all of these horrible fucking headlines is you need to suck it up and make the best of this. And really, ultimately, if you were working a little harder, if you were doing a little better, if you were a slightly more responsible person, you would come out of this even better than you went into it. And so any failure to do that is really not a sign of a cruel intervention from the gods. It's not a sign of chance. It's not a sign of a meaningless and vicious pandemic. It's a sign that your character is weak. And so I started to read in Jarrell's conclusion here not so much a claim to his own toughness and ability to withstand grim reality as I did a reassurance to everybody who is suffering, to everybody who is afflicted, that No, it is not your responsibility to grow from your pain. No, this is not a lesson to learn. No, this is not a source of wisdom. This is just shit luck. So, fuck you, Columbia School of Health. Fuck you, CDC and JAMA and Slate and all of the rest of you. No, this is not an opportunity for growth. This is not an opportunity for self-improvement. Pain comes from the darkness, and we call it wisdom. It is pain. I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS. Since you are listening to the show right now on Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, or any number of other podcast providers and distributors, not curiously enough, given today's topic, Pandora, though maybe at some point, I think, we will see. Since you're listening, to take the opportunity of my spinning through a little introductory patter to go to whatever service you are listening on and subscribe to the show if you haven't already, and leave a rating, which does help on any of these services, but especially on Apple Podcasts, because of course they do bestride our narrow world like a colossus. Or if you're not one for leaving a digital fingerprint, just recommend the show to somebody you think might like it. I will be grateful to you for that. You can reach me. Please do reach out to me with any questions, comments, or suggestions for future guests or show topics or poems that you'd like to hear or you think I ought to know about. You can reach me at sleerickets@gmail.com. Thank you so much. The other day, I was talking to my dad about Alain de Botton, who's a British novelist, public intellectual, and sort of a pop philosopher. He's written about a pretty big variety of subjects. We were talking in particular about his book, The Architecture of Happiness, that came up on a recent episode of the show, and I think I'm going to return to. I may actually do another little bonus episode with my dad at some point on that, since he's an architect. But we were talking really more broadly about de Botton because I think we both have enjoyed his writing. He's a very congenial and funny, insightful writer, but I think we both get frustrated by him as well. And often, I think what we found was that his, on the same topic, he could make really provocative and helpful, sort of novel observations, and then proceed almost immediately to arrive at a really dull, backwards, myopic conclusion about the same topic. And what I think this sort of, what we began to, it began to seem, I think, as if really his problem was that he did just fine when he stuck to description, but he got into trouble as soon as he ventured into the arena of prescription. That is, as soon as he started to use the word should. And I don't think de Botton is at all alone in this problem and this shortcoming. I think that a lot of really smart writers go wrong when they try to prescribe a solution. I think it's partly because of it's partly because their description is so good, right? If your description of the world is not particularly apt, then your prescription for it is not going to be particularly offensive. But if you describe the world well, then unless you happen to be the one who holds all the answers, your prescription is probably going to do one of three things. It's either going to repeat conventional wisdom as if it were some exciting new discovery, and at the same time pretend that it is in fact much easier to apply than it actually is. Or two, you're going to replace the actual problem with a made up problem that's much easier to solve. Or you're going to, three, you're going to replace the actual world with a made up world in which it's much easier to solve the actual problem than it is in our world, right? You're going to distort one or another element that you just described and conveyed so accurately a moment before. There's going to be a kind of a bad faith or a sleight of hand. And I think that's certainly what happens with Debutant. I think it happens with a lot of us. This came up 2 episodes ago, I think, in my conversation with Austin. We sort of followed a different path, but he mentioned having a student who questioned the tendency in a lot of the stories or poems they were studying in class, the tendency to leave things unresolved. She was an engineer or an engineering student, and so her question, which was quite an astute question to Austin, as he said, was, what's the point of leaving things unresolved? And Austin's initial response to that, which is a pretty smart one, was, sometimes it's more interesting to leave things unresolved. Sometimes there are other possibilities that emerge when you leave things unresolved. And that's true, and that is a good answer. I do think, though, that there's another answer that is maybe even closer to the heart of the matter, which is that things are unresolved, right? And representing, in order to represent them as if they were resolved, you would have to distort them. Furthermore, even if there were some resolution, even if there were a way to solve the problem that one has done, worked so hard to accurately describe, most of us don't know what that solution is. So when you have conversations with writers about whether or not you should instruct your reader, the question that should come first is, well, do you know enough to instruct your reader? I've never liked didactic stories. I think most of us really, if we're honest with ourselves, lose our appetite for that stuff way back early in elementary school, if not before. They're just not very fun. But beyond that, I've never felt comfortable teaching a lesson in stories or poems or plays, because I don't know what that lesson would be. I don't have the answer to offer. And all of this got me thinking about how and why this distortion emerges. And I think it tends to be because of one or another species of hope. That is, we see the way the world is, but we hope that something will give, that something will be easier than it appears, that something will turn out not really to be the case. We hope we will turn out to be different than we appear. And hope is, as people have been very fond of insisting over the last year and a half, hope is essential. We cannot live without hope. But I have also come to suspect that hope is actually rather cruel. And it may in fact be, hope may actually be a very efficient way to enforce individual guilt. So the question, if we're going to talk about hope, goes back to a very old story. This is one I stumbled into again recently in reading to my daughter. So this is the story, of course, of Pandora and her pithos, or jar, or as we call it now, box. So Pandora's box was a jar filled with gifts from the gods, although the terms of these gifts are a little ambiguous. Pandora herself was called the all bestowed or all given. Pandora means all the gifts, because all of the gifts, all of the gods collaborated on her composition and endowed her with many graces, many desirable and admirable qualities, though they also made her foolish and possibly deceitful. This was in answer to Prometheus having, Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to man. This was a severe primal offense, and it needed to be punished. So the punishment Zeus devised was to create this shining, dazzling, remarkable woman named Pandora, and to shower her with personal gifts from all the gods, but then also to give her this jar filled with a different kind of gift, perhaps. They then gave her, she was herself a gift, they gave her to Epimetheus, Prometheus' brother. Prometheus, of course, meaning forethought, and Epimetheus meaning afterthought. Epimetheus took her as his bride, was very happy to see her. She was supposedly, she was the first woman, so this was an exciting new development for him. And she wasted no time in doing exactly what she was designed to do, which is to say, opening the jar. She opened the jar, and as we all know, some problems followed. So I'm going to read from the conventionally, I think the oldest known surviving version of this is from Hesiod's Works and Days. I'm just going to read this little passage from A.E. Stallings' somewhat recent translation of the Works and Days. She's, as always, a delightful writer and commenter. Her notes and her introduction are just as fun to read as the poem itself. So this is, Pandora has arrived, and lid or jar in hand at Epimetheus' house, and here is what happened. But woman grappled off the jar's huge lid, scattering its contents as she did, unleashing sorry troubles on mankind. Hope only did not fly. She stayed behind in her impregnable home, beneath the lip of the jar. Before she had a chance to slip out, woman closed the lid, as Zeus designed. More ills galore go roving through mankind. The sea is full of bane, the earth of blight. Some ailments come by day and some by night, bringing men ills. They roam of their own choice, in silence, since Zeus robbed them of their voice. No getting round it. Zeus's schemes prevail. So Zeus sent a jar full of curses, and Pandora unleashed them on the world. She snapped the jar shut again, or perhaps the last item in the jar didn't fly out of its own accord. It's a little unclear here, and I don't have Greek. So apologies right now for everything that follows to Alicia, as well as Aaron Pachikian, Chris Childers, Ryan Wilson, and any other classicists who might hear this episode and grind your teeth in frustration at my ignorance. My apologies. But there is some ambiguity about exactly what happened, but what seems to have happened is that there was a jar full of curses. Pandora opened it up, let them out on the world. From then on, mankind's life was much worse as a result, but hope lingered in the jar, and so hope was a kind of balm or salve for all of these evils. Now, immediately, and I think even a child can see this, there's a sort of a problem here. There's a paradox here, just in the text itself. Because if these curses flew out into the world, and that is how they came to afflict mankind, then what does it mean that hope remained in the jar? Are we meant to think that so hope did not get out? Did did hope stick around, and then did Pandora and Epimetheus and Prometheus apply hope in some way that made it more deliberate? What was hope doing in this jar to begin with? And why do the rules for how she gets applied to human life differ so much from the rules for how all of these evils and afflictions get applied to human life? What's there? There is a kind of a problem. And just out of curiosity, I asked my wife Joanna what her memory of the story was, and she recounted a very similar version of it, but she had a slight revision that I thought sort of resolved the problem. Right? She said that all of these evils escaped from the jar, of course, but then hope was the last item to escape. So hope did not remain in the jar in Joanna's version, but escaped along with the rest of its contents, and was simply the one kind, was the one ameliorating influence included. Everything else was a trial or a torment, and hope was what made these all bearable. So that made a little more sense. I went to a few different versions. I looked some of this up. Again, my Greek is limited, or not limited. My Greek is non-existent, and my research skills are limited. It does look like the word for hope in Hesiod is elpis, or something like this, elpis. And it seems to mean hope or maybe expectation sometimes. So sometimes, it's possible that it doesn't have the same connotation exactly that hope does in English. It also seems that there have been a number of variations and revisions of this particular moment in the Pandora story. In some versions, it seems. Well, here I found a few, and I'll read them because I think they represent a little bit of the variety. So in Bulfinch's Mythology, Thomas Bulfinch offers a couple of versions. Right? He offers the one he offers one very similar to Hesiod's, right? Like the one I just recounted. But then he follows up that account with this paragraph. Another story is that Pandora was sent in good faith by Jupiter to bless man, that she was furnished with a box containing her marriage presents, into which every god had put some blessing. She opened the box incautiously, and the blessings all escaped. Hope only accepted. This story seems more probable than the former, for how could hope, so precious a jewel as it is, have been kept in a jar full of all manner of evils, as in the former statement? So that does seem to make a little bit of sense, that the jar was filled with blessings, and the blessings all escaped. And so when hope remained behind, that accounts for why hope is hope is a balm that we have access to, whereas all of these others disappeared. Now, there are still problems with this version. It seems to be not a very good just so story, because the problem isn't that we don't have blessings other than hope. The problem isn't that hope is the only good thing in our lives. There are lots of blessings. There are lots of good things in our lives. The problem is that there are also all of these maladies. So it doesn't really seem to be accounting for the world as we experience it. So I found a couple other versions in Robert Graves' collection of Greek myths. He provides one version, interestingly, in which Epimetheus acts with the advantage of forethought. That Prometheus warns Epimetheus not to accept any gifts from Zeus. And so when Zeus offers Pandora to Epimetheus, in one version, Epimetheus refuses her. And it is Zeus's fury and having been outfoxed that inspires him to chain Prometheus to that rock and send the eagle to tear out his liver every day. So in another version, those events happen in reverse order. So here's another alternate version from Robert Graves. This is from his collection of the Greek myths. Epimetheus, alarmed by his brother's fate, hastened to marry Pandora, whom Zeus had made as foolish, mischievous, and idle as she was beautiful. The first of a long line of such women. I think that's Graves' editorial. Presently she opened a jar, which Prometheus had warned Epimetheus to keep closed, and in which he had been at pains to imprison all the spites that might plague mankind, such as old age, labor, sickness, insanity, vice, and passion. Out these flew in a cloud, stung Epimetheus and Pandora in every part of their bodies, and then attacked the race of mortals. Delusive Hope, however, whom Prometheus had also shut in the jar, discouraged them by her lies from a general suicide. So this seems to be there are some versions in which the jar belongs not to the gods, but originally belonged to the brothers Epimetheus and Prometheus, and in some cases at least it seems to have held all of the elements that they abstained from assigning to mankind when they were making the race of men. So it's a jar of leftovers that Pandora releases. In this case, as with Joanna's version, hope does escape the jar, but it's delusive hope, and its purpose is to keep men from killing themselves. Because if they had all of these other afflictions and no hope, then life would be unbearable. The Graves version does present a coherent and basically complete account of the Pandora story. Like Joanna's version, it does resolve that basic paradox, but if it has a shortcoming, it's that it simply gives up the detail that Pandora held back or recaptured, the final contents of the jar, the final element, gift or curse. And that doesn't feel like just an indulgence of Hesiod. It does seem sort of like an essentially Greek motif that the Greek gods traditionally they can't undo each other's actions. They can't even undo their own actions once they've committed to a course, but they can modify them. And a lot of the stories have that sort of mid-narrative revision in them, so that Hera in a rage strikes Tiresias blind, but Zeus in sympathy with him gives him foresight. Apollo grants Cassandra the ability to foretell future events, but when she refuses his advances, he curses her with the addendum that no one will believe her. So that little detail that Pandora catches, that last element, that does feel like part of the fun of the story, and the Graves version simply shrugs it off, ignores it. And so in that way, it doesn't feel totally satisfactory. There are a number of minor variations on these accounts, some in which the contents are good, some in which the contents are evil, some in which hope escapes, some in which it doesn't escape, some in which hope itself is an evil. But it wasn't until I read this little cheapo paperback version that my daughter won in a little library contest. It wasn't until I read this version to her at bedtime one evening that I felt the paradox of the story in some way resolved. That this seemed to be the only version I had ever read that handled that wrinkle of hope in a way that seemed really elegant and also true to life. So this is, funnily enough, the Bernard Evslin version of the story. This is from the book The Greek Gods. It's a children's book that Bernard Evslin wrote with his wife Dorothy Evslin and Ned Hoops or Hoopies. I don't know. Pronunciation doesn't matter. So this is a book for children, a collection of the Greek myths, and I'm gonna read a slightly longer passage from this. This is the end of their account of the Pandora story, and I think it's really, again, it threads the needle. It unravels this knot in a way that I was really impressed by. Again, for those of you who are classicists, there may be an obvious source for this particular interpretation. I just have not been able to find it anywhere else, at least not in such elegant terms. So, Pandora, there was a swarming, a hot throbbing, a wild meaty rustling, and a foul smell. Out of the box, as she held it up in the moonlight, swarmed small, scaly, lizard-like creatures with bat wings and burning red eyes. They flew out of the box, circled her head once, clapping their wings and screaming thin little jeering screams, and then flew off into the night, hissing and cackling. Then, half fainting, sinking to her knees, Pandora, with her last bit of strength, clutched the box and slammed down the lid, catching the last little monster just as it was wriggling free. It shrieked and spat and clawed her hand, but she thrust it back into the box and locked it in. Then she dropped the box and fainted away. What were those deathly creatures that flew out of the golden box? They were the ills that beset mankind, the spites, disease in its 1,000 shapes, old age, famine, insanity, and all their foul kin. After they flew out of the box, they scattered, flew into every home, and swung from the rafters, waiting. And when their time comes, they fly and sting, and bring pain and sorrow and death. At that, things could have been much worse. For the creature that Pandora shut into the box was the most dangerous of all. It was foreboding, the final spite. If it had flown free, everyone in the world would have been told exactly what misfortune was to happen every day of his life. No hope would have been possible. And so there would have been an end to man. For though he can bear endless trouble, he cannot live with no hope at all. The last item in Pandora's box was not hope, but foreboding. Another word for this might be foreknowledge. That is, the final curse was a perfect knowledge of all of the evil that was to come. Hope remained with mankind, not because Pandora caught it in the jar, not because the gods threw it in along with curses as a sort of a balm, but because Pandora snagged the final curse and held it back. The final curse being the foreknowledge that would have dissolved all hope. That version strikes home. That version seems both self-consistent and true to life. In this version, I think we see the real problem with description and prescription, right? If your goal is helping mankind, doing good, then of course hope is necessary. You cannot live without hope. But if your job is to describe the way things are, then hope is almost necessarily a distortion. I mean, this is, I think, the problem that hamstrung public health experts in the last year and a half. They got them constantly second guessing themselves because they got caught up between description and prescription and ended up failing at both very often. Hope as a prescriptivist is crucial. As a descriptivist, hope is not a possible future. Hope is not a possibility at all. Hope is merely and literally applied ignorance. If we were free of hope, we couldn't live. But if we were free of hope, maybe we would at least be able to forgive ourselves for failing. A couple years ago, I did an interview for Literary Matters with the novelist J.P. Gritton on the publication of his first book, Wyoming. And I always hate those interviews that you get in literary magazines where it's clearly been conducted by email, either by sort of slow correspondence, or even worse, when the interviewer just sends a list of questions to the interview subject. I just find them really dreary reading because they don't have any of the agility or the surprise or charm of a live conversation. And I also feel like they're sort of awful for the writer because they end up really just being kind of like homework. Like, it always reminds me of those awful lists of short essay questions you'd get at the end of a chapter of social studies in middle school. Just the worst. So I didn't want to do that kind of interview, and I had the good fortune of being able to sit down with J.P. Gritton in person. And so I just recorded it. I just had a conversation with him and recorded it and then transcribed it. It took a little while, but it wasn't too bad. That conversation was an early inspiration for doing this podcast, because it was so fun, and it seemed so much more lively and engrossing, both for me and, with any luck, for you, than one of these essay test interviews. So at any rate, one of the things we talked about in that interview was the question of wish fulfillment in modern fiction. This question was prompted by, of all people, the meddlesome Brian Platzer of previous episode fame. So the question really was just, whether books or novels specifically that indulge in something like wish fulfillment for the target readership are more successful, or if that's kind of, if in order to be in order to have popular appeal, the suggestion was, well, maybe a book really needs to offer this sort of fantasy to the reader. In that conversation, I don't remember if it made it into the final edited version, but we did talk a little bit about Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad, which is a terrific book and a really gripping read. But it does, against the odds, sort of manage to pull off an unlikely kind of wish fulfillment in the middle of hell, whereby the protagonist, who of course goes through just unspeakable suffering in real and fantastical and only slightly surreal antebellum America, she does manage to escape, and even to begin to build a sort of a life as an independent citizen. And she even gets to the sort of the personal gratification of killing the man who has been trying to hunt her down. It does, despite being a really almost a horror novel, it does have a kind of happy ending, so to speak. And I first read Colson Whitehead in college, and I really was impressed by his first book, The Intuitionist. It's been too many years now for me to speak in any detail about it, but it's a really brilliant. I think he actually wrote an essay at some point about the, kind of a satirical essay about the different kinds of debut novels, and he called his he copped to writing I think a postmodern allegory, which is sort of what The Intuitionist is, though it also seems to very much to owe a debt to Invisible Man and to James Weldon Johnson's underread autobiography of Next Colored Man. But so that was a great book. But I hadn't read him for a little while. I came back and read The Underground Railroad, read The Nickel Boys, which is also really good. Actually, maybe even harder to read than The Underground Railroad, because I think it's much closer to our reality today than its predecessor. But that book also managed sort of to pull off a certain kind of wish fulfillment with a twist, because this was really the question that I had for JP, that he and I both wrestled with, was, is it possible to provide something like wish fulfillment in a novel while also remaining true to what to felt reality, to a felt understanding of life as we know it, which tends not to be very much like a fantasy or a Freudian dream. And part of how Whitehead does it in that book is by having. By the way, I'm just spoiling willy-nilly here. So if you are the sort of person who believes that books can be spoiled, then you should probably stop listening now. At any rate, The Nickel Boys is another kind of escape narrative like The Underground Railroad, but it is one in which the protagonist, as we understand him throughout the book, because it skips back and forth between the present and the past, when the protagonist was a boy trying to escape from this horrifically abusive reform school. The way he pulls off the wish fulfillment that is not wish fulfillment is by having the main character, as we understand him, as the same guy we believe has escaped decades ago. We see him get shot and killed as a boy on his way out of the camp, and it's only then that we realize that it was his friend who did escape and who took his name to honor his dead friend, and that's the person we've been following in the present day. So that was, I think, a clever trick. But while I was in the long dark winter before people started really getting vaccinated, I happened on not even an article. I just read the headline of this article in Electric Literature, and it convinced me to go back and read one of Whitehead's books that I had missed. So I'm going to read you the headline, and I'll put a link in the show notes, because it's a good article, but to be honest, the headline is the best part about it. I went back after I read the book and I read the headline, and I read the article. It's a fine article, but the headline is by far the best part. So this is in Electric Literature. This is As the Pandemic Drags On, Zone 1 warns us not to hope. Zone 1 is the name of Colson Whitehead's 2011 pandemic novel. So once again, as the pandemic drags on, Zone 1 warns us not to hope. And this is by Matt Matros in Electric Literature in January of 2021. So I saw that. I ordered Zone 1 and I read it very quickly. It's a really speedy, engrossing, totally entertaining read. I mean, it is grim, but it is very entertaining. I actually think it's one of his better books. And I think wonderfully, it also cuts the Gordian knot of wish fulfillment in a different way, in a whole different way than his other books do, or at least these are the four I've read. I know he's just a maddeningly prolific writer. But so I wanted to just say a word about Zone 1, because I think what Matt Matros gets right is that this is a book that is in many ways written against hope, as a protest against hope. So Zone 1 is a zombie novel, but unlike most zombie narratives, it doesn't take place in the immediate chaos of an outbreak of this zombie plague. It takes place, a year or two out after most of the initial bloodshed has passed and the forms and structures and authority of the U.S. military and the U.S. government have begun to reassert themselves, and even some, the beginnings of a global community of nations have begun to make a claim for this new world. So, Zone 1, the title of the book, refers to a section of Manhattan, and this is a section that has been forcibly walled off and initially cleared out by shock troops, Marines who went through just blowing away zombies. And the goal is that they have designated this as the first sort of clear zone of the new New York. It is, as New York is today, just the population density is insane. And so even after the Marines have gone through and swept through the streets and killed all of the roving zombies, there are still countless zombies, or in this book they're referred to as skells. There's still just countless skells trapped in the various buildings. And so little teams have to go through, building by building, floor by floor, room by room, to clear all of these blocks. And that's the main action of the novel. But along the way, of course, we also get a lot of snapshots and flashbacks of the world before, or the period in between. So it's a book that presents an interesting challenge for the wish fulfillment problem, or an interesting context in which to try to solve that problem. But it also, I think, is a book that the framework of which really serves Whitehead's strengths, because he's just a really masterful storyteller, or masterly, I think I read you're supposed to say. Masterly is more accurate, I'm not sure. But he does have great mastery of storytelling, and he is he's very good at plotting. He plots in a way that feels, both muscular and pretty organic. He doesn't mind indulging in an occasional lyric passage, even at some length, that doesn't necessarily advance the action. But he never lets things go slack. He is he's a really wonderful host as a storyteller. He's very welcoming to the reader, and I think his big flaw is really, it's the only major flaw I've been able to identify in his novels, is his management of tense, or really not tense because that sounds grammatical, so much as time. That he tends to write in what I in the class I took with Reg McKnight, Reg used to refer to something he would call half scene, which is not exposition, but also not scene. It's something like what you might call the imperfect tense. We would do this, and we were, at this time this was the sort of place we would go, and these were the people we would talk to, and often on Sundays we would go, we would have this for breakfast. That tense, which is it's a tense that moves quickly and can include much. And it's a handy tense. That's one that Whitehead leans on really heavily. So heavily that in some books it can become sort of hard to tell when you are, because so much of the book takes place in these big swimming passages of half scene that slip back and forth over the course of the book's larger chronology. In Zone 1, he is both forced by the immediacy of fucking zombie combat. He's forced to lock himself into immediate scenes, that have a specificity and a concrete linear progression that is satisfying as an audience, as a reader. But then he's also allowed, because there's so much hurry up and wait, there's so much stillness and emptiness in this post-apocalyptic landscape, that it is natural for the past to come swimming in, especially because so much of the past world has been annihilated. So the premise of the book both provides a kind of a brace to strengthen some of his weaknesses as a writer, while also allowing his natural tendencies to really to serve the story to the best, in the best way. I will also say just briefly that he's reading Nickelboys in particular. So he pulled off the feat of the two Pulitzers in a row for not 2 years in a row, but 2 novels in a row. His last 2 novels both won the Pulitzer, and especially for the most recent book, it's a terrific book. But I wanted to fucking shoot his editor. I mean, just disgraceful, really, really unacceptable work. Because I think if you are at this point, if you are his agent or his editor, my guess is that what they published is pretty damn close to the first thing he turned in, because he's a capable enough, he is enough of a master, and he is enough of somebody who clearly sort of follows his own whims and interests as a reader and a writer, that he doesn't need a lot of direction. He doesn't need a lot of guidance as a writer. So my guess is that he basically turns in nearly impeccable copy, and then his agent and his editor just pass it along to the press. That's the impression I get, because there were a number of just very easy, dumb little mistakes that got left in for no reason, just no reason at all, except that somebody didn't bother to fix them. And that, it's because he is so successful and so good that it didn't really matter. They knew that it was going to be so good and so clean that it would both be critically acclaimed and commercially successful. And so, there was really no incentive for them, except, perhaps for an artistic incentive, to do their fucking jobs. But in Zone 1 in particular, I want to, just after that rant, I want to cleanse your palate and mine by just reading just one of his marvelous paragraphs from Zone 1. So the part of the pleasure of this book is that the protagonist, who goes by Mark Spitz being the famous Olympic swimmer who, until Michael Phelps broke his record, was the Olympian who had won the most individual gold medals in history, I think, and for swimming. The protagonist is given the name Mark Spitz by his companions for sort of ironic reasons. He goes into it at some point, but he describes himself as basically a middle class mediocrity. He was somebody who always knew how to get by, and really, in the chaos of the zombie apocalypse, it wasn't being a huge badass or being a doomsday prepper that saved him. It was just being sort of a weaselly survivor. So he has this wonderful paragraph here in which you get, I think, a really good sense both of Whitehead's sort of swimmy sense of time, as well as his wonderful command of story as told by backstory, because that's really what it is. And now that I think of it, so much of all of his novels that I've read are story revealed by backstory, and he just does it so convincingly that it's hard to argue with him. So the Mark Spitz is camping out in an abandoned, I think it's an abandoned office building at this place at this point with the rest of his team. He's got a sleeping bag, so he's lying down for the night, and sort of he ends up reflecting on the past. And again, the skells that he refers to, a skell is the word used in this book for zombie. Zombie appears, I don't think it appears anywhere in the book. This is a little bit of a long passage, but it's just too much fucking fun. So here we are. The sleeping bag was comfortable enough on the teal carpet squares, but he missed sleeping in the trees, entwined in the branches like a kite. in the woods, bordering the dead subdivisions, in a public park, going native according to primeval inclination, levitating over koi in the acupuncturist's backyard garden. In those early days, he roved from empty house to empty house like the other isolates, making it up as he went along. He cased the abode in advance of night, selected his entry point, and then swept the ranch house or split level or other locally popular construction room by room. He checked the basements, the closets, the dryer, you never know, made test noises to draw out any skells inside, but not loud enough to alert a pack cruising outside. He discovered plague-stricken unfortunates who had been locked away in attics like the photo albums of bad weddings, and came upon leaking wretches handcuffed to bedposts by fluffy erotic handcuffs. He put down any skell or skells who emerged from the den or romper room, and he made a hasty retreat if it got too hot, taking the pile-covered stairs 2 at a time, or vaulting out the window, the inevitable window, landing messily on the patio set. He knew when it was time to split. It clicked in his brain, the same way he'd known which desk to choose in a new classroom on the first day of a fresh school year. The one that would place him in a zone that reduced the chances of being called on, amid a high concentration of smart kids and inveterate hand-raisers, but at a distinct and quirky angle to the teacher's vision that enabled Mark Spitz to pop in and out of his or her attention. The same way he knew exactly how late he could roll into work without it becoming an issue. How often he could pull off this feat, and how busy he had to appear at different times of the day according to his boss's scofflaw-seeking trawls through the cubicles. He'd always known when to say, "I love you," to keep the girlfriends cool and purring. How much to push a deadline without repercussion. How to smile at the representatives of the service industry so that he got a decent table or extra whip. In his mind, the business of existence was about minimizing consequences. The plague had raised the stakes, but he had been in training for this his whole life. So this is he's just such a winning writer. So one of the little strokes of genius that Whitehead has, that again, that really does prefigure some of what we've gone through in the last year and a half, is that this is a world, interestingly, in which the zombies kill just a catastrophic portion of the population. So anybody who is alive, literally the entire living population of the world at the time that the novel takes place, has, among other things, really severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Necessarily. Everybody has been deeply traumatized. So literally every character is mentally ill in different ways. And it's just sort of something that everyone understands, that everyone has a sort of funny tics, funny little glitches in their personality, in their mood, in their affect, in their manner, their behavior, or their perception. For Mark Spitz, it's very simple, but it is relentless. He sees ash. He sees ash everywhere. Now, one of the, as civilization has begun to reassert itself, of course, one of the things that the New World Order has had to achieve, has had to pull off, is mass incineration of corpses. And so this is something Mark Spitz sees because it's literally there, but then he also sees it inside. He sees it at times when the incinerators might not be running. He sees it everywhere at all times. He sees it settling on his MRE as he's sitting in a dining room. He sees it in the office where they're camping out. It's everywhere. And for Spitz, there is so one of the things that the article that I mentioned did point to is that Spitz stands apart from his co-workers, I guess, his co-workers in clearing out Zone 1, in that he refuses to indulge in any speculation about the world to come. He doesn't imagine what it will be like next. He doesn't imagine the new world. He doesn't look forward to the new world. He doesn't hope for or anticipate or fantasize about the new world. And as much as possible, he tries not to think about the old world. This is partly just a matter of survival, but it's also because, as we see, he finds that it was really in the horror of having everything fall apart and having his tendency to minimize consequences put to this absolute test. It was in running, in sleeping in trees, in hiding out in toy stores to avoid zombie throngs. It was in all of these sort of rat-like tactics of survival that he really found himself, that he really became the truest version of who he could be. And so because the book is told in this, it's told over the course of maybe 3 days, but we do keep dipping back into the past. There's pretty early on in the book, you begin to get a sense that something terrible is happening, and it's really toward the end of the book that it becomes explicit that the main wall holding back, because of course New York is still New York in the apocalypse. And so just as thousands and thousands of people move to New York all the time, now zombies, zombie Americans, zombie wannabe stars are tromping their way to New York City night and day, even in the apocalypse. And so the biggest of the walls that holds back the heaviest wave of approaching zombies, at the end of the book, it finally gives. And Zone 1 falls. And it's in that moment when he sees the wall come down and he finds himself coming to life again. He's galvanized. It brings him back to an immediate sense of the present, back to an immediate sense of himself. It becomes clear that this has really been, this book is a book not of wish fulfillment, but of horror. It's not a dream, but it's a nightmare. The only person for whom this ending is wish fulfillment is Mark Spitz. The ash he's been seeing the whole time, the refusal to fantasize about the future, the sense finally that he was most invested, if anything, in this brutal moment-to-moment mode of survival. That's where he really thrived. That wish, he gets his wish at the end. And so, I think it's a really clever way to get around the problem of providing wish fulfillment to the audience, which undoubtedly makes a book more fun to read. It's, part of why we read a long, plotty book is for the satisfaction of seeing the bad guys get their comeuppance, of seeing the hero achieve his goal. But, when that means that the world of the book is radically unlike our own, then the book is going to have a very limited effect on us. We're going to mostly forget about it. Fantasies are a blast to read, but we forget them the very next day because they have no bearing on us. We are not on the hook. But this, I thought, was a really smart way to have for Whitehead to have his cake and eat it too. There is wish fulfillment, but it is the wish fulfillment is just the consummation of the nightmare. So in planning an episode against hope, I'd initially thought that a great poem to end on would be The Wanderer, the anonymous Anglo-Saxon lyric from 1,000 years ago. It's one of my very favorite poems. I think it's terrific, and I do think there's a lot to talk about. But then in rereading it, I saw how long it is again and how dense it is, even when it's sort of translated, so to speak, into modern English. And I just thought that this episode has already gone on for fucking ever. So I think I may save The Wanderer for another day and instead just read this short poem that I stumbled upon a few months ago for the first time. My in-laws dropped off a bunch of books from my wife's old bedroom probably a couple of years ago, and I've gone through slowly some of these, and I came to the selected poems of Louis MacNeice, and I'd only read a handful of his poems before, but I came to this one, and I thought this was something special. This is The Suicide by Louis MacNeice. Yeah. All right. So The Suicide was originally published in 1961, and it appeared in MacNeice's collection The Burning Perch, which was published in 1963. So this is The Suicide. And this, ladies and gentlemen, whom I am not, in fact, conducting, was his office all those minutes ago. This man you never heard of. There are the bills in the in-tray, the ash in the ashtray, the gray memoranda stacked against him, the serried ranks of the box files, the packed jury of his unanswered correspondence nodding under the paperweight in the breeze from the window by which he left. And here is the cracked receiver that never got mended. And here is the jotter with his last doodle, which might be his own digestive tract, ulcer and all. Or might be the flowery maze, through which he had wandered deliciously till he stumbled, suddenly, finally, conscious of all he lacked, on a manhole under the hollyhocks. The pencil point had obviously broken. Yet, when he left this room, by cat-drop sleight of foot or simple vanishing act, to those who knew him, for all that mess in the street, this man with the shy smile has left behind something that was intact. It's a short poem. It's only 19 lines. There's not really any kind of regular meter. The lines tend to be fairly iambic with a lot of anapaests along the way. So there's a sort of a jauntiness to the rhythm, and there is a lot of internal rhyme, but most of the lines are not end rhymed properly, except for a number of them that return to the same insistent rhyme. So the first line ends with fact. The last line ends with intact. And along the way, we find there's line after line that ends with a word that rhymes with this same sound. Fact, stacked, packed, cracked, tracked, lacked, act, intact. So that there is, despite the breeziness of the narrator, there is this sharp, repeating, unforgettable sound that keeps cutting through all of this banter, or all of this patter, rather. And the tone of the poem, I think, is really part of what makes it so effective. He's irreverent from the get-go. And he spends most of his time pointing to things. There's almost something of a blazon about this poem. Blazon originally had to do with the heraldic crest. And in looking to all of the quotidian items in this man's desk, in his office at work, we see the evidence of his life. But we do return again and again to this final act, both in sound and in substance. I do think that if there's it is a really cinematic effect that McNeice pulls off when he shows us the correspondence nodding under the paperweight in the breeze line break from the window by which he left. Really withholding that last crucial piece of information until the end of that clause. I think we have a pretty sharp shock there. And then I think if there's maybe one line we could do without in the poem, or I could do without, it's probably a cat drop, sleight of foot, or simple vanishing act right toward the end, because we sort of already seen that trick with the earlier line about the breeze from the window by which he left, and because I think sleight of foot is maybe just a little cuter than it is actually funny, and simple vanishing act seems unnecessary, except that it's been a few lines since we've heard that sound act. And it's nice to get another one in there before the end. But otherwise, I think we could probably go directly from the pencil point had obviously broken yet when he left this room to those who knew him for all that mess in the street. This man with a shy smile was left behind something that was intact. Maybe not. Maybe we need something there because we need some sense that he's not leaving to those people. But yeah, I don't know. That line, I trip a little bit over that line. Though maybe that's all right. Maybe I should trip on it. And I also appreciate, I think, of course, of that criticism from A.M. Juster that I mentioned several episodes ago of poems that celebrate or romanticize a suicide. And I think that though this is a moving poem, I don't think it romanticizes the suicide itself. There's a great deal of physical specificity in the poem, so that by the time we get to the condition of the man's body itself, McNeice has really done a lot of preparatory work and showing us the window, showing us all of these particular items, showing us the broken pencil point, something that fine. When we get to the man's actual body, all he has to say is, those who knew him for all that mess in the street. That's all we really see of what he has become. But I think it's evocative enough that we don't need to see any more. It is certainly not romantic. And even the little note of consolation, that he's left something that was intact. It's not the act itself that does that. This is the suggestion that, the pencil is broken, but the doodle is intact. But of course, I don't think that we are meant to believe that it's really just the doodle that he's referring to. Those who knew him have something of this man, and they already had it. This isn't something he brought about by stepping out the window. It's something that he left behind. And intact, I think, nicely, while, of course, closing out that insistent rhyme, also comes from a Latin for touch. Intact, there is some way in which, despite having really obliterated, he's absent from the room. He is a physical non-entity in the room, a palpable one, but he's also just utterly obliterated his body. He's reduced it to a mess rather than the form of a person. And yet there is still this way in which he has left his touch. He has touched these people, and it will stay. Something will stay, which I think is a kind of comfort that doesn't indulge in hope, which is maybe all we can hope for some days. I'm going to read this one more time because it's a short one, and then I will sign off. So this is The Suicide by Louis McNeice. And this, ladies and gentlemen, whom I am not, in fact, conducting, was his office all those minutes ago. This man you never heard of. There are the bills in the in-tray, the ash in the ashtray, the gray memoranda stacked against him, the serried ranks of the box files, the packed jury of his unanswered correspondence nodding under the paperweight in the breeze from the window by which he left. And here is the cracked receiver that never got mended. And here is the jotter with his last doodle, which might be his own digestive tract, ulcer and all, or might be the flowery maze through which he had wandered deliciously till he stumbled, suddenly, finally conscious of all he lacked, on a manhole under the hollyhocks. The pencil point had obviously broken. Yet, when he left this room, by cat-drop sleight of foot or simple vanishing act, to those who knew him for all that mess in the street, this man, with the shy smile, has left behind something that was intact. That was The Suicide by Louis MacNeice, and this is SLEERICKETS. Thank you so much for listening. You can always reach me at sleerickets@gmail.com, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.